Okay, welcome back, everybody. We have an awesome guest with us today. We have Andy Mowat, and I'm super excited about this one. I've told Andy right as he joined, been following some of his podcasts as well that he has out there. Some really good insights around hiring, the RevOps world, and then obviously, Andy, you bring a lot of experience from some of the unicorns that you've been a part of, Box, Carta, Culture Amp, to name a few of those. So I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself a little bit. Let us know where you've been working right now, what you have going with Whispered, and where you've been in the past. Maybe that'll give us a good understanding of how we can get into this conversation around CRM stuff.
Yeah, I have run RevOps before unicorns, Upwork, Box, Culture Amp, and Carta. I'm really passionate about the RevOps space. And so I'd say about a third of my time I spend with GTM Council, which is the top 150 RevOps leaders. We're all talking about how AI is changing GTM. It is, newsflash for people if they're not thinking about it. We can talk a lot about like Claude Code skills and kind of how the RevOps role is changing. And then, I popped my head up like 4 or 5 years ago looking for my next role. And I was like, man, this gets harder as you get more senior. The roles aren't posted. And so as you reach VP and C level, it's a very different role experience. And so Whispered is the philosophy there we have is your next executive role. It won't be posted. It'll be whispered. It truly is the case. We've built this platform that allows top execs to plug on in and collaborate on unposted roles, introductions, and insights on companies. And that is something that's like, it takes a lot of my time, and it's been fun to be able to code up. And then I just launched Whispered Events 2 weeks ago, which has started to take off, which is the similar concept, which is you want to find the best small group dinners, events to go to, but you want the ones that fit for you versus just getting this long list. And on the flip side, like all the vendors are trying to reach people like us that are buyers, and they don't know how to do that. And so I just, at a fundamental level, I think what drives me is two things: is connecting great people, and then the way GTM is transforming are the two areas I spend the most time on.
Awesome. Great introduction. Maybe the very first thing I like asking people, RevOps, I wouldn't say is like new, but I would say like when I work with in the Salesforce space, consulting wise for our company, when we work with tech, that seems to be just like, it's been here for a while. We understand what this is. It's easy to set up. And then from time to time, we don't usually take on clients outside of that niche, but there are some that fall outside of that to where it's like, what is that role? What are we talking about here? So maybe something would be interesting too is how did you eventually get into revenue operations? What did you have before that role? And then how did you move into that space? And
Everybody falls into RevOps. There's no like studying it at business school or undergrad or anything like that. I think I was at Upwork. I joined to run BD working for the CEO. But at some point, and I forget how, I ended up managing an SMB sales team. I realized we needed a CRM. I started playing with Salesforce. I taught myself. Then we needed to start sending a lot of emails. So I figured out how to send, and this is where I really fucked up, which is I think I sent a mass email to 800,000 IT professionals. And so the Elance domain was blocked. I remember like the spam houses. And so I learned all about that. And it's like, I'm a tinkerer. I love tinkering. And I think RevOps people by nature are configurers. They're really good at it. So I also think they're uniquely positioned for this new wave of AI, right? And we can talk a lot about like, how do people cross that chasm and spend time on that. And so, for everywhere I've gone, it's just like, I think a lot of people just fall into it. You probably did as well too. And then you're like, wow, I'm good at this. And so for me, then it just kept spreading and growing and adding pieces to it as I went to different companies.
Okay, cool. You mentioned in your last response that when someone moves from maybe director level or even just maybe mid-level to C-level, that you felt that that's like a big difference in what's expected. I think the people listening to this will probably be those people that are looking to try to move up to this C-level. So there's probably a few in there that work at tech startups that maybe haven't had a whole lot of enterprise background that would be probably interested to understand the difference there. What do you see as the big difference when you make that jump from maybe director to a C-suite, and how does that make the job so different?
Yeah, it's interesting. I actually have an article on my LinkedIn around what is director level. So I feel like we could talk about that as well too. Newsflash, there is no C-level title for RevOps, period, full stop, right? Like I think, that is something you will need to pay attention to at some point, right? Which is if you do not own a number, you are not going to be in the C-suite, right? Like, people are like, hey, COO. I'm like, no, it's a bullshit title. I even have an article on ambiguous roles, right? Like it's COO can mean something different in every place. And so like maybe to I think a lot of RevOps people are smart, they're business MBAs, and they're like, hey, I want to get there. And they all want to get to C level, but they don't want to own a number. And that just doesn't compute to me. So we're actually in GTM Council running a whole like webinar soon on like RevOps leaders who have made it to CRO.
Okay.
But you have to be willing to own a number and take responsibility. Otherwise, like the path to C level is just non-existent. I talked to so many naive people. They're like, yeah, I want to be CEO or this or that, but they don't really understand what it means. So I guess if you want to make it to C level, with AI as a RevOps person, it becomes more possible than it ever has before, right? Like you could actually own the STR number. You could own the inbound conversion number. At some point in time, I've actually taken over demand gen at 2 unicorns. And so I've run different pieces of that. And so I've played with owning a number. I found I'm kind of on that fence of like I could or I couldn't. I had another super senior guy whispered, I was like, wow, you're SVP at a company everybody knows, like feels like the next step is CRO. He's like, no, I know how I tick and I don't want to own a number. And I was like, okay, like that makes sense. And so I think that's like everybody that's listening to this podcast should ask themselves that question right now is like, do I want to own a number or not? And if you don't, like cross off C level.
That's really good advice. I like you're saying. I think, especially what I see from our angle, we're working typically with these tech startups, like I mentioned, and having gone through a few of those myself, I worked for a series of them. A couple of them were able to get acquired or IPO, and you would see that there would be at that beginning stage an influx of people. It's just kind of whoever you can get. We're this new company. You're trying to kind of collect talent, so that's its own thing. And as you get in there, it does somewhat feel like everyone's just trying to climb that ladder as fast as possible to get certain titles, to maybe jump a job, go somewhere else with it. And I like your call out there of really trying to focus in on like what you want to do, being like intentional about what you're talking about internally in some of those meetings where you want to head in the company. One thing that comes to mind, I've heard you say on another podcast was around, I think you mentioned you've had other coworkers, other teammates that you've had where maybe they were in marketing ops, but then raise their hand because they want sales ops experience and kind of being able to figure out how they can get into that world a little bit more. So I like that call out that you're having here, basically being like, instead of just joining a company and hoping kind of things work out and climbing the ladder to get to something that's ambiguous, like you're saying, that may not mean anything. I think it brings us back to the first part of that question, which is like, how do we know what good looks like? How do we even know that that means anything? Because I've been in those positions myself where you join an early stage startup and you have a fancy title or it's bigger than what it was at the last job, but it's like, really, what does this even mean? Like what if I go to another company, how are they going to like dissect this and ask me what kind of value I even brought to the company with this type of title? Like, what does it even bring to the table? So when you're going through that piece of it, how would you say, as far as like maybe advice that way, that you're trying to be intentional and figure out what good looks like? How do you find those jobs that are going to offer those things? I think this probably falls into like your whispered hiring of like probably why you're.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say for me, I prioritize 3 things when I'm looking for a job. One is who I work for. Like your boss matters a lot. And we've got articles and playbooks on Whisper that are all free. They can talk about like how do you evaluate your boss. My biggest technique there is I'll write my own user manual and I'll share it with the boss, with my future boss. I'll be like, hey man, like, or hey woman, I wrote my user manual. I don't expect you to write one, but if you would read mine and they can come back with, that, and we could chat, that'd be great. Right. And they can come back with one of 2 answers. Like, fuck it, you work for me. Just like take the job or not. I ain't taking that job. Or wow, which is every one of the bosses I've worked for is I've read it. Let's just have a coffee. We'll talk and let's make sure our styles mesh. And so that would be one. If somebody that actually cares about your career. I talked to another senior RevOps person a day or 2 ago and their CRO just left and basically they're now working for the CFO and the CFO's never asked like, how you doing? What's going on? And you need somebody that cares, right? At any level. So that would be kind of part 1. I think part 2 would be the trajectory of the company. And so you want to join in that like hyper growth breakout phase. If you join when it's really mature, growth will slow, won't be that interesting if you join before product market fit. So we've got a whole playbook on Whispered around breakout companies. And I think the third one, which really matters to me, is that CEO itself. That person will dictate a lot of the company, right? If they're non-empowering, non-trusting, I'm not saying that there isn't value in CEOs like getting in and driving change, But if they don't believe and trust and delegate, and if they think every idea comes from them, I mean, man, in the last week, I mean, I talked to a lot of people. A lot of people call
Yeah.
me on their careers, and it's like the CEO is destroying this company, and everyone's leaving, and it's just I do respect the urgency the founder mode brings, but I think bad CEOs can destroy a lot of careers and a lot of companies.
Yeah, those are good call outs too, of like looking beyond maybe your direct report and trying to get some information from people about how does this feel overall? Maybe something a little, and that's what I liked about Whispered when I saw it, when I first started trying to figure out if we could make this work for the podcast here. It's a little bit deeper than something like a glass door, right? Like instead of just going to Glassdoor and reading some complaints, actually trying to kind of go beyond that with some references, figure out who could give you some of those insights to figure out if this is going to be the good fit for you moving forward in your own career. I like.
Yeah. I mean, I'd say for me, Whispered fundamentally is I want to see all the roles, right?
Yeah.
So I'd say the three things for Whispered are: one, I want to see every role, right? So if you're popping your head up, you could go find every single recruiter and network and do all that stuff, but you're still never going to see all the roles. Or you could just plug in where other people are like, man, that role didn't fit for me. And so if you go to app.whispered.com/roles, or just, you will see that we see like 90% of unposted roles, right? So that's part one. I'd say part two is how the heck do you get into those roles, right? Just because you know where they're at doesn't mean they're. And so we've plugged everyone's networks in together. And then the third thing is the insights. The one thing we didn't talk about in your question was comp.
Yeah.
And I would say, first, I do not make that a key criteria, right? Like if you're going to work in any reputable company, they're going to have a comp team and it's going to be fairly comped. What I see is, and by the way, if anyone's in RevOps and they're trying to figure it out, like we have 500 RevOps comps. And so if it's wildly off, that'll be the case. But I see them fall when I talk to a lot of CROs and CEOs, I see RevOps comp fall into two categories. This is what we can pay, or 50% of the time, it's like right person, we will find the right thing, right? And so I've coached a bunch of people that are like, oh, that comp's not right. Half the time, it's fully negotiable, and then and maybe a quarter of the time, they're like, oh yeah, well, our TA team got it wrong. Like there was a unicorn, and one Whispered member's like, I'm not going to talk to them. I'm going to comp low, and I pinged the VP. I'm like, dude. Like this, you realize this is miscomped, and he's like, "Oh, fuck, yeah, I gotta go talk to the team." And so I think a lot of people let comp get in the way.
Yeah.
And in the end, we have a really good one on like every aspect of comp negotiation. But at a fundamental level, your answer should be, hey, comp is not the reason I will take this job. I'm focused on making sure the scope and who you are and how I work are all important. Damn right, you will negotiate on comp, but don't negotiate. The learnings that we've learned on this is do not negotiate comp until they fall in love with you, right? Because then you have a lot more leverage. And so I think every time I talk to somebody like comp is the number one driver, I'm like, God, really? I mean, RevOps is going to be paid at a VP level between 300 and 450, right? Like that's what it'll be. And depending upon the size of the company, and there's not that much wiggle room in this. And so it's just, that would be, I don't know. I think people get too hung up on comp
Yeah.
too early.
Yeah. And that's a
And
good.
that being said, there are other people. I talked to a guy the other day, he's like making 190. And I was like, dude, you are worth more. And he's like, yeah, I know. Just too many people think of comp in the top three. I think it's like number 4, number 5.
Yeah. I like that you said too, for both the company and for the person going through it, to try to put this as a back burner conversation. Like you said, it's not when someone's hiring, they know they're going to have to pay you, right? And when you're going to go into an interview, you know that you're going to eventually have a conversation around compensation. I know there's a little bit of a game here that people play with negotiation and how that's all going to play out for you, and to study that. But to your point, when this gets brought up, even for just like my smaller business, when we're hiring for people, and that's the first question that they ask me right off the bat, and I don't even know what skills they have, if they're going to fit in with my team, if they're okay doing the specific tasks that we're going to be putting them on, if they're flexible in certain areas about what we're going to be doing. It's kind of a little bit of a turnoff, right? When you're going through it, because you're like, okay, yeah, like I'll get there and we'll talk about this, but I can tell that this is like the number one thing that you're caring about. But me as like the founder and CEO, I care way less about what I got to comp you on this, because like you said, if you're a good fit, I will find a way to make this work. And I roughly have a good idea of what a fair market comp is for all these rates.
Yeah, and I think one thing that I did not know until I really started building Whispered is do not talk about it, right? They're like, hey, what'd you make? Well, they can't ask you that. And then the second one is, what do you want to make? I think the right answer is, hey, comp is not the driving factor in this. Of course it is, but you don't want to start telling them what you want to make, because the day you name a number is the day you've just capped yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So there, I think sometimes you see some of that with like maybe people that aren't as well versed with that. Maybe that's why they're doing it right off the bat. Is they want to get a number in or get that conversation that, hey, this is important to me. But to your point, someone that's seasoned, that's gone through this a few times, they know that we're going to get to this. So I think that is a good call out to make sure that you don't do that too early, like you're saying. Wait for them to drive that
Yeah,
conversation.
I mean, looking at the VP plus level is very different than looking at the director and down
Yeah.
level. It just is. Like, I say at director and down, well, director, 75, 80% will be posted.
Okay.
Flip that metric to 20% will be posted at the VP level. And so you got to learn, like, how do you find those things? It's a lot harder.
Yeah, for sure. Switching it just slightly. So we've talked a little bit about hiring the right person, getting your team together the way that you want to. Now, let's pretend we hire someone great, like Andy, yourself, you get brought in. When that person comes in, let's talk a little bit about like the CRM specifically when it plays into RevOps. Are there specific signals at like, let's say a tech startup of what you would be looking for to know whether or not the CRM is going to help support growth or it's going to like cause problems for everybody? Like what would be some of the first things you look for as far as their CRM setup?
I mean, CRMs, we're still living in a clunky Salesforce world. You firms like yours definitely. I'm a big believer in outsourcing the Salesforce admin side of the equation, right? Because if you have it in house, your person can walk out the door with all your expertise. So I've oftentimes like outsourced rather than done in house. I mean, I'll just tell you a story on this one, right? Like I
Okay.
walked into
Yeah.
Culture Amp and I was like, looked at the Salesforce and and we had an outsourced person, and I'm like, okay, cool. So I'm taking over RevOps, and I looked at some of these objects and I was like, oh my god, they're just disastrously bad. And no offense to my good friend who ran CS, but they were letting like random CSMs design their own objects, right? And so you need someone that has an overall vision and understanding of the architecture to be able to do that. And so I very quickly said to cool, like I'm going to put and I was worried. I was like, we're going to have to fire this RevOps fractional firm. And I learned it's like, no, the problem was they didn't have anybody thinking strategically in the business as a partner. And so they just built what they were told to build and it was shit. And so I think, you have to have a fundamental, this is where like, it's hard when you see a BizOps leader somehow end up in RevOps that's never actually fucking administered Salesforce, understands the
Yeah.
architecture, right? Like it's kind of annoying actually, and especially all these GTM engineers that have never actually done RevOps. I'm like, really? You still need to understand this stuff because you're still dealing with the systems. So I guess what I would say would be, I mean, I actually built a whole team in Guatemala that was like coding up CRMs for other people at one point in time. And so what would I evaluate if I'm looking at a CRM? There's not too much object bloat. There's like well thought through leverage of the basic Salesforce architecture of like role hierarchy, and you've built some of the basics out versus like at Carta, we had to like at 500 million, we had to like fix role hierarchy. And it's like just silly stuff like that. I do believe that in 3 to 4 years, there's a next gen coming of CRMs and that are going to be easier. And I think part of the problem for me is we still give reps this clunky ass interface that sucks. And, it's like some vendor shows up with a better interface. Like I was an early investor in Scratchpad, and
Yeah.
I'm like, that's a great interface, but you're asking me to pay more, but they already have an interface. And so I am excited where we can split the admin layer from the UX layer, and that'll allow us to give like better UXs and better CRM. I'm a big fan of Sweep. If you've played with
Yeah.
them, you can visually look at your CRM and then make changes to it visually on your flows, and you can show your sales partners and help them understand how things are going to work. And the other big thing on CRM is like a lot of the time systems teams spend is on research of the impact of changes. And with Sweep, you can just be like, tell me what's going to happen, and then it'll happen. So I'm a big fan of that for sure.
Those are great tools to mention too. There's a few of those. I'm friends with Pablo Gonzalez. He's done a few different builds. He kind of started his own thing called Happy Soup that was like the first version of that idea. Put it out for free. There's a ton of people in Salesforce, which I love, that do a lot of stuff for free. And then he moved to a company called Salto that's a really good one. And then he's now spun up his own called DX0 that does something very similar to Sweep like that. Allows you to have some of that like chat functionality inside of there. It's, I think, a flat fee for subscription to it per user. But those things have been really cool coming out with some of the AI functionality to attach to it. Because to your point, you said two things there. You said you liked outsourcing people because you kind of can rely, I guess, in a way, a little bit more on someone outside of the company to be able to be there for you. You have contracts in place, et cetera, to make sure that that information stays with you versus in-house. It's a little more risky, like you're saying, especially at
Yeah, yeah. It's like I've been talking a lot about this with people, which is we were talking last night with the guys at Fullcast, actually on Monday night at dinner with a couple people around. I don't really want to have like a comp expert on my freaking
yeah,
payroll.
yeah,
I
yeah,
want the firm that knows that, right? And so the architecture of Salesforce and why we did things and how to do that is fairly hard. And so if you have a director of GTM systems and that person walks out the door, you're kind of fucked. And you can't ship anything for a little while. And
yeah,
so I kind of actually like paying a fractional firm
yeah,
to do it because the fractional firm's never going to walk away from the revenue.
yeah.
And so like I had a really great experience. We took Culture Amp from 5 million to 150 million in ARR, and
Nice.
we used a fractional firm the entire time. And so I oftentimes will like say you build the architecture externally and you do some of the strategy internally, and then the two work well together.
That's fantastic. And you've said this a couple times. If this is like too specific, we can make it a little more broad, but it would be interesting to know when you've scaled these companies from these smaller revenues up to 100 plus million. You've talked about architecture in Salesforce. We talk a lot about this when we're meeting with new startups, which is like, hey, what's working at, let's for example, at a million ARR is not going to work at 10 million. At 10 million, what's going to work here for your structure in Salesforce is not going to probably work at 50 million. You're going to have different problems that you're solving within the business at those different revenue ranges. And that in turn is also going to come with different automations we're going to want to have, different people that you're going to be having that we're going to have to probably change the architecture for. An easy one would be on the demand gen side, like you're saying. You're going to likely hire more sales reps. Okay, we got to have a different lead assignment function. We're going to have to assign this different. Do you now have territory based? Do you now have performance based? Like you got to kind of take those things into consideration and
Do you have CPQ? Do you have
yeah,
all
right.
these
All this
things that
stuff
you're going to need
adds
at different
up.
stages? Yes.
100%. So kind of question would be maybe at like what stage do you feel like it becomes necessary to have someone with that more architectural mindset around Salesforce? Is that from the beginning in your opinion? Or is that at a certain revenue range where you're like, okay, we got to start considering how we start really setting this stuff up?
I mean, I think from like 0 to 2, 3 million in ARR, I'm going to expect my VP of sales to kind of get their hands in and do it, maybe with a fractional agency that can kind of help them avoid some of the mistakes. And at some point, you'll bring in that expertise and they hopefully won't have to rip out too much crappy stuff.
Yeah.
That was what was fun at Culture Amp, which is, there were like 4 or 5 objects that just immediately I killed, but it wasn't like they were being used very well or done anything like that. But I was able to like avoid, like it boxed 500 million in revenue when I was there. And there were things like, I was like, God, we really need multi-touch attribution, but like that's never going to happen. And so, it was one of the first 3 or 4 calls I made was to Aaron Bird at Visible. I was like, hey, we need Visible. And so you start to know like what pieces do you need to put into place at what points in time. And so, yeah, your question was around when do you need to hire? I mean, no one's really hiring a RevOps person until they get to 3 or 4 million. At that point, they're hiring one person. I think the mistake a lot of companies make is they hire somebody junior that hasn't seen the mistakes before. And so there they should either hire somebody, if you're growing really fast, hire somebody senior or hire a firm like you guys.
Yeah. And when you're hiring that person, are you relying on that RevOps person to kind of drive what the architecture should be built out inside of Salesforce? Or do you want to find someone in Salesforce that's an architect and kind of rely on them? I think it could be either or from what I've heard from some other folks.
I think you need to be fluent. That person that you hire needs to be fluent enough in architecture, right? So, like at Carta, like they didn't let me touch the systems, but like I was in the conversations and I was able to push my business systems team on, like, I hear you're saying this, but like I'm able to go that next level and ask those questions. Like, am I still building the actual architecture? No, but like, can I have those conversations? Yes. And when you start to, this is this magical box, then you're probably not that valuable.
Yeah. I like you said that. We hit that a lot with some of these early stage folks. Maybe they have someone in where they can kind of talk about Salesforce, but I do feel from my side of things as a fractional team, Salesforce, we might be able to give you some experiences we've all had collectively of like, hey, this is how these companies have grown. This is what we've seen. This is what we've built out. But at the end of the day, we're not, we're doing a lot more of the technical than we are so much on the driving these business decisions. So when it comes to some of the business decisions, it's helpful, like you said, to have someone there that knows enough about that to be able to speak to us. But then they're really taking the context from those meetings inside the business that you're having internally and saying, hey, this is like how we're building the model for our business. This is what we want to eventually put into Salesforce. How would we actually get to that point? And sometimes we've had the reverse, right? Where people kind of lean on us a little bit more. And I think it maybe they can skate by, but I wouldn't recommend that you try to go to like a fractional service like myself and say, okay, how do we set up all of this stuff for our business model and run it this way? Like again, we can maybe tell you some experiences there, but I don't necessarily think it always puts you in the best spot.
You need a RevOps person in your org that understands why a multi-select pick list is a bad fucking idea,
Yeah.
right? Like it's and because otherwise you're going to have somebody that's a business person. Yeah, that's a great idea. Why don't we just do that and then we can design it? And then they bring it to someone like you, and you're like, no, right? Or even now with AI, like I'm actually ripping out most of my pick lists, and so you need to understand data and structures. And I always say 3 years ago, my proxy question for a RevOps hire was it was basically like, can you pull your own data out of the data warehouse? And because that means you understand data structures and you understand SQL and you understand like you're fairly technical versus just there. And you also don't have to wait for our analytics team. And now my question is like, show me your GitHub account, right? Which is like, I think things are changing pretty fast. But like if you are in RevOps and you're working if you're even requesting anything from the business systems or a team like yours, and and you're like suggesting a multi-select pick list, get the fuck out of RevOps, right? Like this is wrong. Like it's like they should not exist
Yes.
if they don't work well, and the data quality that for the analytics that you're going to do is just it doesn't work, right? And you should know like timestamping and how it works, and like it's like I always have to educate every company I go to what's pipeline coverage, right? And why can't you pull that out of Salesforce? And so you then the ability to like understand not just the CRM but the data layer and how the data layer and how you can report on it is really
Yeah. And I think going back to one of our first questions, this is really, I feel like, what makes the difference between knowing what good looks like and somebody that comes in that has some experience doing some of these things. Because what you're talking about, those things as a base level, I would love that for every person that we ever worked with to be the case. Like you've also called out in some of your past experience working with someone that's fractional like us, you'll sometimes have those situations where the relationship that they have established with the fractional team is you just do technical stuff. We don't hear out anything that you have to might say about best practices or strategic stuff that you would say not to do. We really just want to have you be this task taker, which is this is what you're doing, build it, tell us when it's done, and come back. And it does create some of those situations like you're talking about where it's like, this is kind of just one-on-one. Like you need to have, like you said, timestamps. We need to have pipeline coverage. We need to have these basic things. And the person driving those decisions to us should know why those things are important. We shouldn't have to go back and fight with the business to try to explain why that is an important thing for you guys to have. So I think that's an excellent call out too. Okay, well, I think these have been awesome conversations here. We've talked a lot about some of your hiring processes, what good looks like, how people can kind of figure out a little bit more about Whispered, where to get in there. I want to double tap on that before we end this, which is places they should go to follow you. You mentioned like you've had some blog posts, you've had some places that they could go to read specific articles. Do you have anywhere specific you want to direct people to go to that we can link for you?
if you're looking for your next role, go to whispered.com. If you're looking to find awesome events, go to whisperedevents.com. If you're just looking for all my content, go to Andy.
Awesome. Okay. Well, we'll make sure we have those linked in the bottom. I appreciate you being here with us today, Andy, and look forward to speaking with you after this as well.
Awesome, Jordan. Great chat.
Thanks.